Hello and welcome back to Designing and Building Custom Apps Using Dynamics 365 for Customer Engagement Volume 1. In this section we're going to look at building HTML web resources to extend our user interface. We'll look at an overview of the MVVM pattern and how knockout data binding implements that MVVM pattern. And then we're going to get cracking and build our seat plan selection view model, unit test that view model, then go and create the view, and then create some JavaScript ready for production with minification. The MVVM pattern. So what is MVVM and why would we use it? Well, it stands for Model View View Model. And it's a pattern that is in some ways similar to MVC, which you may have heard of already. It was made popular first in the Silverlight and WPF frameworks, but we're using it for HTML and JavaScript. And it's primarily about the separation of concerns between your user interface and your business logic. And one of the great things about separating out these two things is that it allows us to unit test our business logic without actually having to have a user interface on top of it. So if we had a button, we don't actually need to click that button to test any functionality that's behind it. We just simply instantiate our view model and call the command that that button is wired up to. And another byproduct of this is it allows us to change the user interface without actually affecting the business logic. So we may have a button on one user interface, but on another user interface, it may be a drop-down context menu, for example. So the golden rule is that the view model knows nothing about the view because there could be multiple views on top of that view model. At no point does the view model make a call to any element in the view. It would only be the view that is data binding to the view model and calling functions in that view model. So you can kind of think of the view as like a control room in a power station with lots and lots of dials and knobs and switches. And our view model has got wiring connected to that dashboard. So when we press a button in our view, it would then wire up to the view model to run a particular function, and any values that are changing in the view model are monitored via the wiring up to the dashboard so we can see it in a gauge or a dial. And because of this, it means we can wire up our view model to other views. And so we could have a remote monitoring device, which again is sending commands to our view model to make changes, as well as monitoring values in the view model to show it in gauges. So it's a layering approach. At the top level, we've got the view, and then we go down to the view model and then the model. And the model is like, you can imagine it's a database where we are retrieving values and we are updating values. And so the unit test would purely be creating an instance of the view model and simulating those calls that the user would be performing and then monitoring the values that are coming back. And I think this is probably one of the biggest differences between the MVC model and the MVVM is the view model is primarily around a user-centric view of our business logic, which actually makes it really nice to program and unit test. And so on top of that, we've then got data binding and commands that are sent to the view model. So how does this data binding work? Well, if you're not familiar with it, it kind of looks like magic, to be honest. But we're using a library called Knockout. And you can look at and learn more about Knockout at knockoutjs.com. And what Knockout is a very small and lightweight JavaScript library, which we can include in our user interface library. And it has this declarative two-way binding syntax that we can add into our HTML to then wire up this two-way response from our view into our view model. And that's why it kind of looks like magic when you see it done. And what this means is that with this data binding, the user interface is automatically going to refresh and represent the values in our view model, kind of like the wires between our dashboard. And what it also gives us is this templating mechanism. So we can very easily define an HTML template that we need to use wherever there is a particular value in our view model. Now this makes writing HTML code hugely more simple than if we were to have to create DOM elements manually and then insert those into our page and then manage the updating of those values. It removes so much code from our view that we would normally have to write, but Knockout is actually doing that all transparently for us. So an example of one-way data binding is where we have our view HTML and we've got this strong tag, and if you notice there is this data bind attribute, and this is not part of HTML, this is Knockout specific. And what this is telling Knockout is when we call the apply bindings on our view model, what it will do is it will see this text data binding function, and it will say, okay, we need to pick up the first name observable from our view model and replace the contents of this strong tag with the value of that first name observable. Now notice that it's not just a simple string field. We have this special KL dot dot observable, and that means that what this is doing is it's wrapping a normal JavaScript value inside an observable which handles all of the events, so that when we do this apply binding it can go and get the value, and if we change the value, that observable will notify our user interface that it's changed, and then it will get updated. So literally it's like magic. So an example of two-way data binding is very, very similar, but here we've got an input control rather than just a normal strong, so we can actually change this value in the input. So it happens in a very similar way. We've got our observable. What happens now is that when the user interface is first rendered using the apply bindings, the text value of this input will show what the contents of our observable, which is Bob. But if the user then goes and changes that input value, because we've got two-way data binding, it will actually notify the observable and it will update the observable. And if there is anything else bound to that observable, it will update as well. So in our previous example, we had our piece of text. So if we had both our input and our strong tags, if I type into my input tag, input text box, it's also going to update that strong text value as well. So we start to get this magic auto updating of our user interface and synchronizing it with our view model. So with templates, it's using the same data binding mechanism, but here what we're saying is we've got a div and we're data binding using the for each function, and we're saying for each passengers. And inside that we're saying data bind text. So similar to what we've just seen, it's going to show the text of this span is going to be the name property. And in our view model, if we've got an observable array that contains two passengers, each with the property name, what will happen is that when we data bind to the view, Knockout will replace that HTML with a templated version which is going to repeat for each of the passengers and show the name of each of those passengers. And this is all going to be done for us, and whenever we change that observable array, the great thing is the user interface will be updated to reflect it. And we're going to be using this quite significantly in our seat selection HTML web resource, because we're going to show collections of passengers and allow us to drag and drop between those collections, and Knockout is handling the majority of that for us, as you'll see. So here is a simplified version of our seat selection HTML web resource. And what it's allowing us to do is to select all of the seats for each of our passengers in a booking. And we're going to do that through a drag and drop user interface. So on the top, we've got our seat selection view, and that's wired up to our view model. And so the view's responsibility will be to select which view model and actually run the data binding, so Knockout can actually start wiring all of those events up. And then we're going to say load seats. That will mean that the view model will go off to call the web API to retrieve the currently assigned seats and any passengers that are not assigned. And then it's going to create an observable set of arrays for the seats and the passengers in each of those seats. And that will mean that the view model will be able to then be wired up automatically by knockout to that HTML, so that all the HTML templates will suddenly magically appear and show the seats and any passengers that are in those seats, as well as any unassigned passengers, just by data binding to those observable collections. And then what we can have is we can use a drag and drop binding to allow the user to move between those different collections. And the great thing is that knockout will just simply remove from one collection and put it into another collection when we drag and drop. And then we can have assign after assign functions called every time we drop something. And that after assign can then set the seat allocation and remember which passengers have been changed. And so that when we make a call to the save seat assignments, we will then pass an update for each of those passengers to the web API. And so whilst we do all of this, we're actually going to create a unit test to simulate a lot of this functionality without actually having that HTML sitting on top of it.